Okay, so this week we're going to talk about Mendelian inheritance or Mendelian genetics, which is really a way of predicting the genes offspring would have based on the genes of the parents. Now, this was first discovered by Gregor Mendel, who was an abbot in the early 1800s, and he was famously known for his pea plant experiments, where he noticed the traits of the offspring of pea plants were in particular ratios depending on the parents of those offspring. And when we're talking about Mendelian genetics, we're really talking about eukaryotic organisms. So organisms that are diploid and that make haploid gametes. That is going to be important to how we're able to predict what traits the offspring are going to have based on the parent. So it's really important to understand the process of meiosis and how it creates gametes. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit right now, just to refresh our memory from last week. But before we do, we also need to talk about allele interaction. Now, this is something else that was also noticed by Mendel, who saw that some traits will dominate other traits based on the alleles the organism has. Okay, so let's take these two people as an example. And what we're going to look at is hair color for these two people. Now, if you remember, since these are people, they're eukaryotic and these organisms are going to be diploid, meaning they have pairs of chromosomes. Now, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, but we're only going to focus on one because we're only going to focus on one gene. Okay, so I'm just drawing a cell from each one of these people and just looking at one of the pair of chromosomes that they have. And when we're talking about genes, there's genes throughout these chromosomes, but we're looking at one location of this chromosome for the gene that's in question. So remember, these locations where we find these genes are called loci. So we're going to look at the loci right here for hair color. Let's just say the hair color gene is located right here on this pair of chromosomes. Now remember, these are pairs of chromosomes. So the same gene here is the same gene here on this pair of chromosomes. However, their sequence can be different. And if you have different sequences for these genes, we call those different alleles. So alleles are different sequences of the same gene. So let's say the male here who has brunette hair, since we're looking at hair color right now as the trait, let's say they have two different alleles for this hair color. Let's say they have, I'm going to represent them by big B and little b. Okay, so the sequence for big B is actually going to give you brunette hair, just like this male has. It has brunette hair. All right, well, the sequence for little b will give you blonde hair. However, when we're talking about these hair color traits, we're actually talking about dominance. And this is something that Gregor Mendel noticed, is that some traits show dominance over others. So what this means is that even though this male has a sequence for blonde hair, he's not going to show blonde hair because he also has the sequence for brunette hair. Brunette hair is going to be dominant to the blonde hair. So you will not see blonde hair in this male because it has at least one allele that is brunette. This brunette is going to mask the blonde. So even though he has a sequence for brunette and blonde, he's only showing brunette hair. So we say that the brunette hair is dominant to blonde hair. Okay, so since brunette hair is dominant to blonde hair, what are all possible alleles that you could have in order to have brunette hair? Well, you could have this combination of big B, little b, where you have one brunette and one blonde sequence. However, since brunette is dominant to blonde, you're going to have brunette hair. Or you could have two big B's here, and you'll still show brunette hair. Nothing's changed there. Okay, so let's go to this female who has blonde hair. What alleles must this person have in order to show blonde hair? Well, if it has any big B's, this person's going to be brunette hair. So obviously, this person has no big B's. The only way they could show blonde hair is if they have two little b sequences for this gene, two blonde hair sequences for this gene. That is the only possible way to show blonde hair. All right, so this is what we mean by allelic interaction. How are these alleles interacting with each other? Well, if you have a big B and a little b, the interaction is the big B is going to dominate the little b. So the big B is going to mask the little b and be shown. So the only way to show blonde hair or to show this little b sequence is if you have two of them. That's the only way you're going to show blonde hair, because you don't have a big B to dominate the little b. And when we're doing this, the most common way to write this out is to represent these sequences by capital letter, lowercase letter, where the capital letter is the dominant allele and the lowercase letter is the recessive allele. So this is just one example of this. looking at one gene and two alleles of that gene. Now, this brings us to the next important concept you need to understand before we can move forward with Mendelian inheritance is genotype. When we're talking about genotype, we're talking about what two alleles do you have for a particular gene. Okay, so with this, I'm going to keep using the brunette hair and blonde hair as an example. So when we're talking about genotype, we're talking about what two alleles do you have for a specific gene. So with the blonde hair, brunette hair, we have three possibilities because we always have two alleles for any gene since we're diploid. We could either be big B, which means we have two sequences for brunette hair. We could be big B, little b, which means we have one sequence for brunette hair and one sequence for blonde hair, or we could be little b, where we have two sequences for blonde hair. Now we have terms for these different combinations that an individual could be. When we have two dominant alleles for a particular gene, we call them homozygous dominant. And if you break down the word, it tells you everything you need to know. Homo, the prefix homo means the same. Homo means the same. Zygous means joining together. So really what it's saying is the two alleles that are joined together are the same. That's what homozygous means. And then it tells you what those two alleles are, the dominant ones. The next genotype is heterozygous. And again, breaking down this name tells you everything you need to know. Hetero means different, all right? And again, zygous means joining together. So it's really saying the two alleles that are joining together for this gene are different. And since there's only two alleles, dominant and recessive, it is implied that one of them is dominant and one of them is recessive. So we don't need to write anything else over here. This tells you everything you need to know. And then the last genotype, again, is homozygous recessive. But this time it's recessive. So remember, homo means the same, zygous means the alleles coming together. So the two alleles coming together are the same. And what are those two alleles? Well, they're the recessive ones. So these are the three possible combinations for these two alleles of this gene for any individual in the population that we're talking about. All right, so this is an important concept to understand. What are genotypes? Well, genotypes are what two alleles do you have for a specific gene, because we always have two alleles for a gene since we're diploid organisms. All right, well, going back to this example, we could see that the genotype for the male is going to be heterozygous, since it has two different copies for this gene, while the female is going to be homozygous recessive. All right, and that's what related to the traits that they have. But can we predict what the genotype of the offspring of these people are going to be? That is where Mendelian inheritance comes in. And it has to do with meiosis and how gametes are being made. And remember, here gametes are sperm and egg. The male is going to make a sperm while the female is going to make an egg. And the sperm and egg are going to be haploid, meaning they're only going to have one of these alleles in the cell. And then when the sperm and egg combine together again to make a child, to make an offspring, they're going to make a diploid organism. All right, to fully understand this, though, you have to remember what the products of meiosis are. Okay, so let's say this male, he's made up of trillions of cells that are haploid just like this for this gene. One of these cells are going to divide through meiosis to create sperm for this male. What is going to be the product of that meiosis? Well, if you remember, the product meiosis is 4 haploid cells. So if you don't remember the steps of meiosis, you should probably go back and take a look at those videos again to really understand what's going on here. But the ultimate result is that even though this is one pair of chromosomes, they're going to duplicate during S phase of meiosis. You're going to have actually 4 chromosomes here, 2 of this copy and 2 of a copy of this. And then those 4 are going to split up into 4 different cells by the end of meiosis. And this will be the result. So you're going to have 2 cells that are going to have the dominant allele for this gene. You're going to have 2 cells that are going to have the recessive allele for this gene. Notice all of these cells, these gametes that were made, the sperm that were made, only have 1 copy of that gene in each one of these cells. They're haploid. They only have 1 of the chromosomes of the pair of chromosomes that was from the parent. Okay, so let's go to this female. Now, what are going to be the gametes the female is going to make? So she's going to make 4 haploid eggs, but what alleles are they going to have? So again, these pair of chromosomes are going to duplicate in S phase. You're going to actually have 4 chromosomes, all with little b on it, and then they're going to split into their individual gametes. So what is the result of meiosis? Well, the result is 4 eggs that are all haploid with a little b sequence, the blonde hair sequence, the recessive allele. Okay, so let's say these 2 individuals had a child. They had a baby together. Can we predict what the genotype of that baby is going to be for the hair color? Well, it's really just based on probability. All right, so one of these sperm are going to fuse with one of these eggs. So what are all the possible combinations of these? Okay, so let's start with this sperm right here. So let's say this is the sperm that ends up fertilizing one of the eggs. So if this sperm came over here and fertilized this egg, the child would end up being big B, little b. This sperm could have fertilized this egg, potentially, which would have ended up with big B, little b. The sperm could also have come over here and fertilized this egg, which would be big B, little b. Or this same sperm could have fertilized this egg, which would have been big B, little b. This next sperm could have been the one to fertilize the egg, and if that happens, we end up with the same results. 4 chances of being big B, little b. It could have been this sperm that fertilizes the egg. So what's the result if this happens? Well, if it fertilizes this egg, the child would have been little b, little b. It could have fertilized this egg, again, result in little b, little b. Or this one, and the result would have been little b, little b. And the same thing with this last sperm. Since it's a little b here, the 4 results are little b, little b. So we know the offspring is going to be one of these 16 combinations. So what are the chances for each one? Well, you simply just take the proportion of them. So for big B, little b, you have 8 combinations that result in big B, little b out of the 16 total. And how about the homozygous recessive? You have 8 combinations that result in little b out of the 16 possible combinations total. So the result is you have a 50% chance of being heterozygous, or the offspring has a 50% chance of being homozygous. In other words, you have a 50% chance of being brunette hair, or you have a 50% chance of being blonde hair. Okay, so this is one way to do it, but obviously this is time consuming and it can get complicated with how many arrows you draw and all these other things. Is there a simpler way to do this? Well, there is. It's something called a Punnett square. So a Punnett square is a technique to figure out the Mendelian inheritance based on genotype of the parent. So how you do this with one gene is just write out the different alleles for each parent. So for the female, we had a little b and a little b. And for the male, we had a big B and a little b. So we're just making a grid here with these. And then you simply just put the different combinations of alleles the offspring could have into this grid. So here would be big B, little b, for if these are the two gametes that came together. Here would be big B, little b. Here would be little b, and here would be little b. And you can see that 2 out of the 4 possible combinations is big B, little b, so you have a 50% chance of that. And you have 2 out of the 4 possible combinations of little b, meaning you have a 50% chance for that. All right, so Punnett squares are a quick and easy technique to figure out the genotype of the offspring based on the parent's genotype. Now, we did this with a heterozygote and a homozygous recessive parent. Let's try it with a different combination. What if both the parents were heterozygous for this hair color? Okay, so now we're saying that both parents are heterozygous. Well, we already have the male here as heterozygous, big B, little b. So now we'll put the female as big B, little b too. So if 2 parents were heterozygous for this hair color, now the question is, what are the chances the offspring are going to be the different hair colors? Well, we just take all the possible combinations of these gametes that are formed. So these 2 coming together would create big B, big B. These 2 coming together would be big B, little b. These 2 coming together would be big B, little b. And then these 2 coming together would be little b, little b. All right, so what's the proportion or the chances of each of these genotypes? So big B, you have 1 in 4 chance, which means you have a 25% chance you're going to be homozygous dominant for brunette hair in this combination. For heterozygous, you have 2 out of the 4 possible combinations that are heterozygous, meaning you have a 50% chance of being heterozygous. And then finally, you have little b, which you have a 1 in 4 chance of being, so you have 25% chance you're going to be homozygous recessive. This is the probability that the offspring is going to be each one of these genotypes. So if those 2 parents that are heterozygous had 1 child, there's a 25% chance that child is going to be homozygous dominant. There's a 50% chance it's going to be heterozygous, and then there's a 25% chance it's going to be homozygous recessive. Now, this is the genotype. What hair color, or what are the chances of having the hair color, blonde hair or brunette hair? Well, those we consider to be phenotypes. So the genotype is the 2 alleles you have. Your phenotype is what trait is shown because of those alleles. So I'm going to write this over here for phenotype. All right, what are the two possible phenotypes? Well, you could have brunette hair or you could have blonde hair. All right, so looking at the genotypes, what genotypes give you brunette hair? Well, having Big B will definitely give you brunette hair, having two of the dominant alleles for that. But also having a Big B, little b will give you brunette hair. So the easiest way to write this is to say Big B, which is the sequence for brunette hair, and then that the second allele doesn't matter. It could be another Big B or it could be a little b. Either combination is going to give you brunette hair because the Big B is dominant. Okay, so what is the chances of being brunette hair for this offspring? Well, we simply just add up how many organisms have a Big B something and divide it by the total number of combinations. Well, here's a Big B something, here's a Big B something, here's a Big B something, and then this one's not. So you actually have 3 out of 4 chances of being brunette, which means you have a 75% chance the child's going to be brunette. What about blonde hair? Well, out of the genotypes, there's only one possible genotype that will give you blonde hair. That is being little b, little b. That is the only way you're going to be blonde hair is if you're homozygous recessive. Well, what's the chances of being blonde hair? Well, this is the only chance or the only combination that will give you blonde hair. So you have 1 in 4 chances of being blonde. Okay, so just to recap this, the Punnett square is really showing the different combinations of the gametes from the parent. So we represent the alleles for each of the gametes here, and alleles for each of the gametes here, and then see all the different combinations of them. All right, for the genotype, we're talking about what 2 alleles the offspring is going to have. So there's 3 possible genotypes, and this is the probability of each of those genotypes based on the Punnett square. And then we could also look at phenotype, which is the trait that is expressed based on the genotypes. There are 2 genotypes that will give you brunette hair, whether it's Big B, or Big B, little b. And here is the probability of getting brunette hair. And then here's the genotype that gives you blonde hair. The only time you're going to have the phenotype blonde hair is if you have this genotype. And you have 1 in 4 chance that happens, so 25% chance. Okay, so everything we did right here was for 1 gene and 2 possible alleles of a gene. So whenever we do a Punnett square that is only consisting of 1 gene and 2 alleles for that gene, we call that a monohybrid cross. By monohybrid cross, we mean just 1 gene of 2 heterozygotes. So that's what we just performed here, was a monohybrid cross. So here are your hybrids, and there are only 1 gene that we're looking at, so monohybrid cross. We can do this with more than 1 gene though. So we're going to look at an example of that now. Okay, so let's go back to our couple here as an example. So now we're going to look at 2 different genes. Let's say we're going to look at a gene for hair color and we're going to look at a gene for eye color. So for hair color, we're going to say that Big B represents the dominant allele, which is brunette, while little b represents the sequence that will give you blonde hair, or the allele that will give you blonde hair. But then we're also going to look at eye color. So let's say that the brown eye color, which the female has, is going to be dominant, and the blue eye color allele is going to be recessive. But since we already used B to represent the hair color, we got to come up with a different symbol for the eye color. Now, it doesn't matter what symbol you use as long as you're consistent. So I'm going to use R here. So big R, always the capital letter, represents the dominant. So remember, the dominant allele for eye color is going to be brown eyes, which means little case or lowercase r is going to be for blue eyes. Okay, so let's take a look what's going on in the cells here. Okay, so remember, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So the chances are that these genes are going to be on different chromosomes. So now we have to look at 2 different pairs of chromosomes to follow what's going on here. So let's say this first pair here is going to have the gene for hair color. So remember in our last example, the male had 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele since they were heterozygote for hair color. Well, here the male has blue eyes. All right, so if the male has blue eyes, what is the only possible combination of eye color? Or what is the only possible combination of alleles for this eye color? Well, remember, blue is recessive, so the only way this male could have blue eyes is if they have 2 lowercase r's, or 2 recessive alleles for blue eyes. So let's say the loci for eye color is on this pair of chromosomes and about this location. Okay, well, the male has blue eyes, so what is the only possible combination of alleles this male could be to have blue eyes? Well, since the blue is recessive, the only way it could show blue eyes is if the person has 2 recessive alleles for that gene. So it has a copy of the recessive allele and then another copy of the recessive allele to show blue eyes. All right, now let's look at the female. Now the female for the hair color has blonde hair, which is recessive. So the only possible two alleles this female can have is a lowercase and lowercase, a recessive and a recessive. It's the only way it's going to show blonde hair. And then over here at this loci for eye color, this female has brown eyes, so they could be homozygous dominant or they could be heterozygous. Either way, it's going to show brown eyes. So for this example, let's just say the female is heterozygous. So it has one copy of the dominant allele and one copy of the recessive allele. All right, so we're about to do a Punnett square again to figure out the chances of the phenotypes for the offspring of these two parents. But before we do that, we really have to understand what's going on with meiosis again. Now remember, with meiosis, each one of these pairs of chromosomes are going to duplicate and then split apart. So you're going to have one copy of each one of these chromosomes per gamete. Okay, so I'm just going to focus on the male right now because the same thing applies for the female as far as what's going on with the gamete formation. But let's see all the possible combinations of gametes that could be formed from this male. Okay, so let's say for this first gamete, it got this half of this pair of chromosomes right here. All right, and it's going to get one of these halves. So let's say it got this one. All right, this is still a haploid cell. You only have half of the pair of chromosomes that has hair color, and you only have half of the pair of chromosomes that has eye color. All right, but which one of these chromosomes matches with these chromosomes is completely independent. All right, this is called the law of independent assortment. Even though we had this chromosome and this chromosome end up in the same cell over here, the next cell could have this first chromosome, but it could also have gotten the other chromosome that contained eye color. All right, another cell could have gotten this chromosome for hair color that had little b, or it could have gotten this chromosome for eye color. And then you could have gotten this chromosome for hair color and then this chromosome for eye color on the last possible combination. Okay, so what are all the possible gametes that could be formed from this male? Well, you have two that are big B little r, that's a possible gamete. Again, this is haploid since you only have one copy for each one of these genes. Or you could be little b little r. All right, can you predict what the allele is going to be for the female? Well, every possible combination of chromosome to chromosome can be there. So we could have little r with a little b, or we could have a little r with a little b for the female. Those are all the gametes that this female can make. The female's gonna make two that have big R little b, and the female's gonna make two that have little r little b. Okay, so let's do a Punnett square then. All right, so for each axis of the grid of the Punnett square, we need to write out every possible combination of gamete that could be formed. So the top we usually do the female, and if you remember, we have two possibilities of little b big R for her gametes, and then we have two possibilities of little b little r for her gametes. For the male, we had two possibilities of big B little r, and then we had two possibilities for little b little r. Okay, so what are the genotypes what are the possible outcomes for the genotypes of the offspring of these two parents? All right, all we have to do is have every combination come together in our grid of our Punnett square. So here'd be big B, little b, right, this combination, and then the other chromosomes coming together would be big R, little r. All right, for this offspring, we could have a big B, little b, right, big B, little b, and then we have a big R, little r. For this one, we'd have a big B, little b, and we'd have a little r, little r. And this one on this row is going to be big B, little b, and again, little r, little r. Now you do this for all of these, so I'm just going to speed this up. Okay, so let's look at our possible genotypes now. Okay, so we need to represent every possible combination of the female gametes with the male gametes. So every possibility is either big B, big R, little r. That's one possibility. Another one is big B, little r. That's a second possibility. Another one is little b, big R, little r. That's a possibility. And then we have little b, little r, little r. So these are all the possible genotypes the offspring can be based on the parents' gametes. There's no other possibilities based on these gametes. All right, so what's the chances of each of these genotypes? So there's 16 possible combinations here. How many are big B, big R, little r? Well, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 4 in 16 chance that it's going to be big B, big R, little r, or this genotype, which means the offspring have a 25% chance of being this genotype. How about for this genotype? Well, again, we just count them. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 possible combinations that give you this genotype. So again, we have 4 out of 16, so you have a 25% chance. How about this genotype? Well, again, we have 4 out of 16, so you have a 25% chance. And then for the last genotype, we have 4 out of 16, which is a 25% chance. All right, what about phenotype? Well, every possible combination of phenotype, we need brunette hair, which could be big B anything, and then we need one that has brown eyes, which is big R anything. We need one that represents brunette hair and blonde and blue eyes. We need one that represents blonde hair and brown eyes, and then we need one that represents blonde hair and blue eyes. And again, just like before, we're going to have a 25% chance for each of these combinations. Now you need to go through each one of these steps when doing these crosses. 1 in 4 chance or a 4 in 16 chance for each of these genotypes and each of these phenotypes because of the alleles that the parents had. Now remember, the female was homozygous recessive for blonde hair but heterozygous for brown eyes, and the male was heterozygous for brown hair and homozygous recessive for blue eyes. Let's do one more example of a true dihybrid cross. Now remember, a dihybrid cross, di meaning 2 genes that we're looking at, hybrid meaning that they're heterozygote for both. Okay, so going back to these parents, now we're going to look at what happens if both parents are heterozygote for both of these genes. So just like before, the alleles, the dominant allele for hair color is brunette, while the recessive allele for hair color is blonde. The dominant allele for eye color is brown, while the recessive allele for eye color is blue. Now, since both of these adults are going to be heterozygote for both of these genes, they're going to show the dominant trait because the dominant allele is always going to mask the recessive allele. So you're going to have brown hair masking the blonde. You're going to have brown eyes masking the blue. Okay, so let's look at the possible combinations for the gametes of the male. And again, the same thing applies for the female, but just to save time, we're only going to focus on the male right now. Well, the first gamete could get this chromosome, and due to the law of independent assortment, it may get this it might be in the same cell as this chromosome. So this gamete would have a big B for the hair color and a big R for the eye color. The next gamete could get this chromosome for eye color, but it could have gotten this chromosome. The next gamete could have gotten this chromosome for hair color and gotten this chromosome for eye color. This gamete could have gotten this chromosome for hair color and gotten this chromosome for eye color. Or the last gamete could have gotten this chromosome for hair color and this chromosome for eye color. So here are all our possible gametes. We have one that has big B, big R. We can have one that's big B, little r. We have one that's little b, big R, or we can have one that's little b, little r. All right, and the same would be true for the female. So let's again do our Punnett square of this true dihybrid cross. Okay, so once again, we got to write out all the possible gametes on the axes of our grid. The top is going to be for the female, while the bottom is going to be for the male. So for the female, we had a big B, big R as a possible gamete. We had a big B, little r as a possible gamete. We had a little b, big R as a possible gamete, and we had a little b, little r as a possible gamete. And the same was true for the male. Okay, so let's write out all the possible combinations for our offspring to see what the genotype or the probability of the genotype for the offspring are going to be. So I'm going to speed this up since we've already done this, but we're following the same rule where we take the combination of the B's and the combinations of the R's for each of the cells of the grid. Okay, so here are all our possible combinations for the offspring. So now we got to figure out what the possible genotypes are going to be. So again, for the genotypes, we need to write out every combination that there is. Okay, so we have 9 possible combinations. So let's see how many we have of each of these combinations compared to the total combinations that are possible, which again, there were 16 in this grid. So starting here with homozygous dominant for each of the genes, how many do we have that are homozygous dominant for each of the genes? Well, here in this grid, we can see that there's this one, and there's no other one. So this one has homozygous dominant, no other cell has that. So we have a 1 in 16 chance of being homozygous dominant for both genes, which is a 6.25% chance. All right, how about the next one? Homozygous dominant for hair color, but heterozygous for eye color. Well, we have this one and this one. So we have 2 in 16 chance, or 12.5% chance. All right, so you would do this for each of these genotypes. Again, I'm going to speed this up just for this video. Okay, so here are our genotype possibilities. So if those two parents had one offspring, this is the chances for each of the genotypes. Now, one way you could check yourself to make sure you didn't make a mistake is to go ahead and count how many of each of these there are. They should add up to 16. So if 1 for this one, we have 2 for this one, 1 for this one, so forth. So if you add these up, we should have 16 total. 16 out of 16, so all 100% of the offspring are accounted for. Okay, but that's genotype. What about phenotype? What are the traits, the possible traits of the offspring? Well, there's 4 possible combinations, right? We could have brunette hair with brown eyes. We could have brunette hair with blue eyes. We could have blonde hair with brown eyes, or we could have blonde hair with blue eyes. So to represent those, remember, you just need one dominant allele, and the other allele doesn't matter. It could be dominant or recessive for each. So for brunette hair and brown eyes would be represented as that. Brunette hair with blue eyes would be represented as that. Blonde hair with brown eyes would be represented as that. And blonde hair with blue eyes would be represented as that. So what are the chances for each of these phenotypes, for these offspring? Well, again, we just count up how many of each of these possible combinations there are. So how many possible offspring could have a big B something and a big R something? Well, we have 1. I'm going to change the color up so we can see. So we have 1, big B something, big R something. 2, big B something, big R something. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So we have 9 out of 16 possible combinations that for brown hair and for brunette hair and brown eyes, which means you have a 56.25% chance of the offspring having brunette hair and brown eyes. All right, what about having brunette hair and blonde or blue eyes? What are the chances of that? Well, let's count how many we have. We have brunette hair with blue eyes here, brunette hair with blue eyes here, and brunette hair with blue eyes here. So you have a 3 out of 16 chance for that combination, which means you have 18.75% chance of having brunette hair with blonde or blue eyes. How about blonde hair with brown eyes? What are the chances of that? All right, so we have blonde hair, brown eyes here. We have blonde hair, brown eyes here. We have blonde hair, brown eyes here. So again, we have a 3 out of 16 chance of having this, which means we have an 18.75% chance of having blonde hair with brown eyes. for our offspring. All right, but what about having blonde hair with blue eyes? Well, out of all of these possible combinations, here is the only one where it has blonde hair and blue eyes. All right, so you have a 1 in 16 chance of that happening, or 6.25% chance of having blonde hair and blue eyes based on the gametes of these parents. Okay, so being able to perform Punnett squares and understanding what dihybrid crosses and monohybrid crosses are is important. It is one way we could track dominant allelic interaction. And this same method is applied to producing things like pedigrees or family trees. If you're tracking genes through a family, you still need to be able to do these Punnett squares in order to figure out the possible offspring or what the offspring might be. So these Punnett squares are important to be able to do. All right, and it's also important to know the difference between genotype and phenotype. Genotype is what two alleles do you have for a gene, while phenotype is what trait is being expressed because of those alleles. This whole time we were doing dominant allele interaction where we have a dominant allele and a recessive allele, which means the phenotype for the dominant trait can either be homozygous dominant for that gene or heterozygous. Both will show the dominant trait. While the only time you will see a recessive trait is if you have two recessive alleles or are homozygous recessive. Now, I do want to mention that there are other types of allelic interactions out there. Dominance is just one of them, and it's the easiest to use to demonstrate dihybrid and monohybrid crosses, and that's why we used it in this video. But just keep in mind, when you get further along in your education, you're going to see that there are other types of allelic interactions, such as codominance or incomplete dominance. But those are topics for other classes. In this class, we're just going to focus on dominant interaction. And also remember, when we're talking about genotypes as far as homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant, or heterozygous, we're talking about individual genes. A person could be homozygous dominant for one gene, but be heterozygous for another gene. And based on the law of independent assortment of our chromosomes during meiosis, we could have different combinations for the offspring of those parents. Okay, so hopefully this video helps clarify some of these concepts and helping you understand how Punnett squares are created and how to actually do a Punnett square in order to figure out the probability of certain offspring between two parents.